designed to free you from the four walls of today for a half hour of high adventure.
Today's episode, we're speaking with Professor John Skorupski of St Andrews University. John studied philosophy and economics at Cambridge before lecturing at the University of Glasgow and later becoming the chair of moral philosophy at St Andrews. He's the author of many books, including Why Read Mill Today, The Routledge Companion to Ethics, and The Domain of Reasons, content of which will form part of our discussion today. We're also lucky enough to be joined with Rollo Hutson, a fourth-year engineer at Durham University. Rollo's just completed what sounded like a fantastic year abroad in Berlin, and it's great to have him back in England and on the podcast. So today we're talking about normativity. So if I say to you, my shirt is green, and I also say green shirts are the best, what's the difference between those two statements?
Yes, so one of them is in the lingo descriptive, and the other is normative. That's terminology which is itself something that not everybody likes. They wonder what the term normative means. But I think we can just start with a kind of intuitive understanding. Best, good, ought. These are normative terms. Other normative terms are, as people say, thicker. That is to say, if I say, that's admirable, I guess I'm saying that's worthy of admiration. And worthy of admiration means something normative.
I see.
As in worthy. But it's also more specific because it's giving you a push towards a particular emotion of admiration, let's say. If I say that's despicable, that's disgusting, you can see the gradient. I mean, that's despicable probably means, you should despise it, but that's disgusting, that's not so obvious. I mean, which side of is it descriptive or normative?
So is it some sort of value judgment that pulls them all together?
Yes, that's just another normative notion, the notion of value. A judgment of value is a judgment about the value of things. But if I tell you that it's wrong to lie, is that a value judgment? I mean, what's the value?
It's not purely a grammatical thing that ties all of them together. It's something much more complicated than that.
Well, tying them all together is part of the
difficulty.
It's part of the discussion.
Course.
You would obviously want to ask, okay, you've given us some examples of normative terms, and as it were, just pointed and said, that's normative, that's normative. Ought, good, wrong, value. But can I have a general characterization or definition? And at that point, we get into controversy because people have different ideas. One of my ideas, I'm not the only person to think this, but there are many people who disagree. One of my ideas is that the basic normative concept is the concept of a reason. So if I say the fact that you're going to enjoy this meal is a reason to eat it, I could have said that's a good meal. I could have said you should try eating that meal. Reason seems to be a normative concept that I can always characterize the other ones in terms of. In that sense, it's basic. So there's facts about the world, and there are reasons to do things or believe things, or a bit more controversially, reasons to feel things.
I see. And you say that when something is morally wrong, what we're really saying is there's reason to blame. Is that surely people's opinions would differ on whether something was blameworthy or not?
Sure, for good, absolutely. But so long as the differences match the differences of view as to what's wrong, it doesn't affect the definition, does it? If I tell you that this is wrong means the attitude of blame towards it is justified, we can still disagree about what actually is wrong, i.e. what there's reason to blame.
Okay. So going back to just normativity in general, the role of normative statements in everyday life.
Well, again, you've got to cast a large lasso, really, because people tend to think of action with normativity. And so they say the point of normative judgments is to guide action. If I just tell you that there are 9 planets, if that's the number there are, if there are 9 planets, then I don't seem to be guiding any actions. Right?
No.
You might say, oh, fine, so what? You know? But people say, if I say, you really ought to do a course of astronomy, which will tell you how many planets there are, then that sounds action guiding. The problem with that is that we also talk about beliefs. So we should believe that there is global warming, or there is sufficient reason to believe that there is global warming. And we talk about emotions in normative terms. When I say, you shouldn't be so offended, she didn't mean to be rude. So that's not exactly action guiding. Yeah? So it's action guiding or belief guiding or emotion guiding.
This is where some of the ambiguity comes.
Right, it's guiding.
So all of the normative statements have reasons of various descriptions. Would it ever be possible for a descriptive statement to have a reason, or do they just exist as they are?
For someone to have a reason to make the descriptive statement, or for the descriptive statement itself to say something about reasons?
Or perhaps for the descriptive statement to be based on a fact, for that fact to be based on sort of other things that have reasons or other facts?
Well, facts can give you reasons, and there could be reasons to believe that something is a fact. But is that, I mean, you're thinking of some third category, or?
No.
No, right. Okay. I mean, that's another problem about the action guiding idea, because if I say something to you like, there's a bomb in there, it's about to explode, you might say, well, that's pretty action guiding.
Yes. Okay.
And what you mean is that gives me reason to do something like vamoose as fast as possible.
Yeah.
But the statement itself is not normative. I haven't said anything about what you should do. I've just, in a quiet, calm way, said, by the way, there's a bomb there, it's about to explode. That's descriptive.
Right.
Describes the world, as it were.
Would you agree that normativity and the inclusion of normative statements is the biggest factor that distinguishes ethical discourse from scientific discourse?
It obviously does distinguish them. You have to say something more about ethics to pick it out, because after all, aesthetics also is distinguished in that way. Epistemology is distinguished in that way. You know, epistemology is about what constitutes a reason to believe.
But the other way around, could science be characterised as not having any normative statements in it? Do you think that would be a fair definition?
It wouldn't be a fair definition, because that includes a lot of things that aren't science.
Of course.
Like,
but science couldn't include a normative
the
statement.
Thames is about a few hundred yards away. I don't think that's a scientific statement exactly,
No.
but it is certainly free of any normative vocabulary.
An inherent property of science that it can't include.
It's value free or non-normative or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. Well, I go along with that. Of course, that leaves open other questions like, is your scientific view influenced by your underlying values? That seems to me to be a psychological issue, to which the answer is very probably yes.
Yeah.
But it's not a philosophical claim. Philosophical claim would be that science is inherently value-laden, and that you just can't make a clear distinction between a scientific statement and something that expresses a value. So some people want to say that.
As soon as you choose a course of action based on something scientific, it would end up including normative terms anyway. For example, if you, as you said earlier, if you should believe in global warming and believe it's happening.
Right.
Perhaps.
Well, as soon as you choose a course of action, yes. I mean, if you're choosing on the basis of reasons, as against just putting a pin into a random selection of.
And your reasons could be kind of descriptive statements, and on their own.
I think they would be, ultimately, wouldn't they? I mean, so what reason is there to take into account the science? I take it that the reason is that it's more likely to give correct predictions. And what reason is there to give correct predictions? Well, because we're less likely to be destroyed. You do get to a normative stance in the end. I mean, somebody could say, well, why shouldn't human swine be destroyed?
Good question. Do you have any sense in what it is in the structure of the human mind that makes us live by these norms?
Well, not in the sense in which that's a question for a neurophysiologist or a psychologist.
No.
The structure of the human brain, as it were. What is it? You could ask, what role do normative claims play in the evolution of our overall view of things? That would be more like a philosophical question. And then you could, I would argue that they play a big role because of the fact that the view we come up with is influenced by normative principles of reasoning which we think are correct. And were we to think some other principles were correct, we'd come up with a different view of the world. So in that sense, there's a bundle there.
Do you think that the norms have come from evolution, mainly?
Well, everything's come from evolution.
Yeah.
Parche the Pope.
True.
I mean, so it's kind of, people seem to say these things with a tremendous sense of, how fantastically relevant this is, but yeah, of course they've come from evolution.
Yeah.
I mean, when my ancestors were fish in the sea, I presume they didn't have any norms.
No, presumably not.
So the answer is trivially yes, but, or at least given current science, trivially yes, obviously. Evolution is an empirical theory. But what's the philosophical payoff?
So what does David Hume mean when he says we can't get an ought from an is?
Well, that's a question that a scholar of Hume could spend a lot of time on. What he's saying there is a point about the distinct relation that comes in when you start talking normative talk. So long as you're talking about the facts, you talk, of course, from a logical point of view in terms of predicates, relational expressions. You say this table is bigger than that table, so is bigger than is a relation. And there are plenty of relations like that and properties which, whenever you're talking about how the world is, you bring them, you say that it instantiates this relation or that property or whatever it might be. So that's discourse about the world. Now suddenly you start, he says, to his amazement, you start bringing in a completely new relation, right? Which is something about the ought relation. Given the fact that so-and-so, you ought to such and such. That's a relation, but where's it come from? Right? That's his point, and then he says you can't, well, he doesn't say this, but the implication is you cannot derive it from any of the relations that are just descriptive relations.
Okay.
It's a new relation. And how could, in the end, it's a kind of principle to appeal to a principle that the logicians call the principle of conservativeness, which is how can you get a new relation from a discourse having a finite number of relations in it, except by definition, right? Where does it suddenly pop up from?
See, so if I was to say that humans evolved from meat-eating animals and so we ought to eat meat, that would be an example of getting a normative statement from a descriptive one, but with the gap between those two.
Well, obviously the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise.
And is that always the case with trying to derive an ought from an is?
Well, how complicated do you want to get about this? But there is the question of whether you can deduce it using principles of logic alone. So in your example, you can't deduce the conclusion. from the premises using principles of logic alone.
Hmm.
But then there's a question of whether it necessarily follows.
I see.
So the idea of something necessarily following from something else is wider than the notion of principles of pure logic.
But people say these things so frequently in everyday life. They must have... All the people who say these claims must have some intuition that it does follow, otherwise they wouldn't say them.
I mean, I'm accepting that they might be right. In other words, let's take a slightly less recherche example. And supposing I say, just acted in a way that you knew would be very hurtful to that poor girl. Right? So you acted wrongly. Or weaken it a bit. So there was some reason not to do what you did. I accept that certainly the weaker conclusion necessarily follows. So there was some reason not to do what you did. But I wouldn't claim that it followed by pure logic. Because pure logic is what you find in logic books, right? You don't find anything about being cruel and reasons in logic books. But if what I'm saying is right, then there's some sort of principle here, like there's always reason not to act in a way that you know to be hurtful to someone else. Is that necessarily true? If it is, then you've got an ought from an is, or at least a reason from an is.
Slightly related to that, is there a way to compare sort of some value of different normative statements, perhaps even opposing ones? People could totally disagree on something. Is there any way you can compare the value of their separate statements?
Well, presumably you could compare them in respect of truth and falsity. I mean, if you were disagreeing about whether intentional cruelty is a bad thing,
right? Yes.
And you say, "Oh, it's perfectly okay," and I say it's right, it seems to be that it is a bad thing. Then it seems to be I'm right and you're wrong. That's a kind of comparison.
But would you be able to persuade the other person as to your...
Not always, no. Can you always persuade people about the truth of the theory of evolution? Can you always persuade people that 9/11 wasn't done by the CIA?
True. Well, then perhaps you could persuade a higher proportion that you could.
Well, that's an interesting one, actually. Do you think a higher proportion of people think murder is okay in all circumstances than think that 9/11 was done by the CIA? Which group of lunatics is smaller? Right.
So there's a school of thought from Alistair McIntyre.
Yes.
That because ethical language in the developed within the context of some sort of goal, that normative terms like good and bad can still carry considerable moral weight. So, for example, if I say that this microphone, if it can't easily record sound, then we can legitimately say it's a bad microphone because it doesn't fulfill its purpose effectively. Do you think that's a good view to have on things? You can give something a moral weight based on its purpose and whether it fulfills that purpose or not.
So, if I can put it in a sort of technical way, you're asking whether evaluations always presuppose some sort of objective teleology.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's a very large and interesting issue. And my real answer is no.
Okay.
But there's obviously something to it, otherwise people wouldn't. So
I suppose you always have
clearly you can talk about how well or badly a thing fulfills a function. And I can talk about, he's got a rather bad heart. That means it doesn't circulate the blood very well or very efficiently, those are still normative terms, or in the way that is required for survival of the organism in question. Let's say that.
That seems like a pretty good way on the surface of making a normative statement a more positive one.
Well, yes, but I also think that there's more to our normative judgments than these teleological assessments. So, supposing you're the doctor and you tell me, look, you really must give up smoking, it's bad for you. I think what you mean there is that it's bad for my health. Okay. And I might say, well, to hell with my health, what's that got to do with you, mate? I just want to have an objective account of what will improve and what will deteriorate my health, so thank you for that. In that sense, I understand what you're saying when you say it's bad for my health, but that doesn't show it's bad for me. Because what's good for me is smoking a hell of a lot. And never mind if that's going to reduce my lifetime by 10 years. That's my judgment.
I hope this isn't a true example.
No, I have a certain sympathy for kind of, existentialist smokers of that kind.
But there must be some functions which are so universally agreed upon that we can have such a really rigid sense of good and bad in that sense.
Well, yeah, so you remove... I mean, this is the way in which, as it were, the Aristotelian or eudaimonistic tradition in ethics develops objective teleology. So, there is such a thing as your objective function as a human being. There is the objective function of this screwdriver. Its objective function is to drive screws. And if it doesn't do... And if it, just bends the screws, then it's a bad screwdriver, no question. But there now is, according to these people, an objective function of human beings. And so we can assess human beings by how efficiently they perform their objective function. The big question is, what is their objective function? That's why I said I sympathise with the existentialist smoker.
Yeah.
He might say, look, I don't think there is such a thing as my objective function. So at that point, I have to give up on this objective teleology line.
See, you mentioned the buck-passing model of value, or of good and bad. Could you just outline what that is?
Yes, well, that says that when you say that something is good, you're saying there's reason to have some sort of favouring attitude towards it. That so far doesn't say much. You need to spell out something about what the favouring attitudes are. It might be choosing, admiring, desiring, liking, ... But the basic idea is that to say that something is good is, I don't know quite why people call it buck passing, but I suppose you're passing on to the next question. Saying it's good is just saying there's some reason to favour it. So the next question is, well, what is the reason and what is the favouring attitude?
And is there ever a point where that analysis stops?
Yeah, once you've spelt out the favouring attitude and claim that there's reason to have it. So if I say to you, Venice is the best capital city for us to have our holiday in, I'm saying there's some... context there shows you that I'm saying there's most reason to choose Venice as a place to have a holiday in. But it can be ambiguous, He's the best man for the job. Well, that's not...
There's a lot more explaining to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any objections to this model?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the main one?
Well, why should I tell you? I'd say the main one is, I guess, sort of what you might call a cart before the horse objection. If there's reason to have your holiday in Venice, that's because it's the best place for a holiday. Not because the best... You can't say the best place to have a holiday is Venice because there's reason to have a holiday in Venice, whereas you can say it the other way around. So the argument is that the analysis of good and bad and best in terms of reasons gets it the wrong way around. You should analyse reasons in terms of good, bad and best. Primitive concept is value, reason is derived, whereas people like me think the primitive concept is reason.
Does it matter if it can work the other way around as well?
Well, it's certainly true that you might be able to get an account in both ways. There's nothing conceptually to stop that. I mean, it may or may not be the case. I like to give the example of the primitive constants in propositional logic. So it's and, or, if, then.
If and only if.
Well, if and only if,
Yeah.
not, of course. And you can define that circle in terms of any two of them. You can, in fact, define them all in terms of one basic constant, so-called Scheffer stroke. And so if somebody says, look, this is my preferred definition, if, then, and not are my basic constants, you could say, well, fine, good, totally good. Of course, you could do it another way. And that's in principle possible with what I think of as the circle of normative concepts. But I don't actually think anybody's produced a plausible alternative. That would be very good and worthwhile if they did. It would help you understand the logic of normative concepts.
Yeah.
In terms of the normative concepts, what's the implication of choosing either the belief that good, bad, and best come from reasons, or the other way around?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that happens to be true, that they all could be defined in terms of the concept of a reason. Is that philosophically significant as against just an interesting conceptual analysis? I'm inclined to say that it is, although it gets very debatable here, because it's big philosophy. So I think it is useful to think in that way because it brings to the fore a meta view about the nature of normativity, which links up perhaps more with Kant than, say, with Hume. By a meta view, I mean a view about the nature of normative concepts, not just a view that's phrased in terms of normative concepts.
Okay.
As in, are they objective?
So, somewhat related to that, how would you describe to a non-philosopher such as myself the relevance of normativity and discussing it and the concept of it in both everyday things and perhaps other areas of philosophy, or in a sort of a way that would...
Well, it's much easier to discuss it in other areas of philosophy than its relevance for anything outside philosophy. That tends to be regularly the case. But actually, I think in the case of normativity, there is relevance to culture outside philosophy. It just immediately gets into the sort of very grandiose sort of level of assertion, that we all like to avoid. But here's a brief grandiose statement. I think that skepticism or nihilism about normative judgments is a sort of feature of modernity, of from the middle of the 19th century onwards, something like that. And I think that has had big impacts on politics, on science. If someone could find persuasive ways of showing, that normative judgments are perfectly okay, some of them are true, some of them are false, there are ways we have of establishing which are true and which are false, there would be a lot to be said for doing that in terms of improving the culture, if you like, the general culture of aesthetics and politics.
Right.
Within philosophy, it's a very big issue relating to some fundamental philosophical divisions. I've mentioned one, Hume versus Kant.
So, obviously people's beliefs differ immensely from culture to culture. For example, some people think capital punishment is good, others think that it's bad. And societies are dominated by these cultural norms. Yet it seems like moral progress has still happened. So how is moral progress even possible when all of these different societies have so many different viewpoints?
Yes. Well, that's a complicated question. First of all, there's the question of to what extent do they have different viewpoints. I think that's less true than people think. It's certainly obviously true, no question.
But there's still commonalities.
Yeah, exactly. If you sort of start digging deeper and asking, what the underlying beliefs are. Often it'll depend on different factual or descriptive beliefs, specifically supernatural ones.
So do you think it's the common thread between all of the different norms that drives the progress, perhaps?
Well, that's a tempting view. That along come the philosophers and they say, oh, okay, you disagree about abortion or capital punishment. Well, can you tell me what the underlying reasons you have for being in favour or against? And then as we draw out the underlying reasons, we may be able to find points of agreement. Because people see that it doesn't really follow, or people see that it depends on beliefs which they haven't thought about very hard and they're not sure are true, and so on. So a kind of optimistic view of the history of moral discourse is that sort of thing's been happening. That's sort of thing Peter Singer thinks, There are these expanding circles of where we just, that's one of his mechanisms that he thinks produces progress, that we started off thinking we've got duties to the family, then we thought we've got duties to the village, then we thought we've got duties to the nation, and now we see that we've got duties to human beings as such, the expanding circle. So that's, I'm rather inclined to agree with that to a point.
So a related question is there any value in a gut moral intuition? So if I say something normative and I'm saying I really this is a gut thing that I believe, is that just a product of where I'm born and my culture, or do you think there's something more to a
well, in the end, these gut feelings, or if you like, intuitions, i.e. gut feelings that you've thought about a bit and asked yourself, how much do you really think that? Intuitions, let's say, or dispositions to believe, they're the data for a moral philosopher. Where else can you go? You then start trying to get what's called reflective equilibrium, where you have, general principles and particular moral intuitions or reactions, and start trying to bring them together in a coherent way, and then you have other people's disagreements, you start trying to bring those together in a coherent way. A lot of these intuitions are extremely robust in terms of how easy it is to move them.
And what would be an example of one of those?
Well, I suppose the right thing to do would be to start off with some really basic ones, like lying is there's always reason not to lie, or causing pain to innocent people, always something you shouldn't do unless there's some very special reason and so on. But much more specific intuitions than that, and really quite surprising ones. Here's an example I like. Let's suppose that a homicidal nutter is loose on the station esplanade, and you can see that the way he's going to fire next, he's going to shoot your friend. So you push your friend out of the way. What, you've heard this, haven't you?
No, I was saying Rollo's in trouble.
You push him out of the way, knowing that somebody else will get plugged. Variation. Same situation, except that what you could do is push that same stranger. So he gets plugged and your friend survives. Is that okay?
It suddenly feels totally different,
Yeah. And I don't know of anybody who doesn't think that. Okay, they might say, look, I want to sort of mitigate the difference between these two, but certainly the gut intuition, if you like, is, that you had no right to push that person in the way of the bullet. Whereas, yeah, sure, it was okay to save your friend. Somebody was going to get plugged, but it was okay to save your friend. And I think that's an example of the psychologists like these sort of things. They've got onto these famous experiments, which were thought experiments in moral philosophy. But the trolley problem is now universally discussed.
Stolen it.
Yeah, but it's very interesting what they've come up with. Very, very interesting. There's a book by a guy called Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. Anyway, he's now a big figure in psychology on the basis of this work on the psychology of morality. And he's done a lot of work on various dilemmas, like the trolley problem, and shown you how much people come to agree, actually, without any general theory.
So it's this group intuition that we can derive perhaps lots of moral theories from, in a way.
Yes, or maybe we can't derive anything very sophisticated by way of theory. So somebody like Henry Sidgwick, who, as you probably know, was a great utilitarian moral philosopher, or at least a moral philosopher who was very interested in utilitarianism, he thought that you could show that utilitarianism could be completely systematized with what he called moral common sense. So you could have just this theory, utilitarianism, that would explain and systematize and fill in the gaps of ordinary moral common sense. A lot of us would say, sorry, that's a bit too hopeful. There are no doubt various broad principles involved, which you can extract by reflecting on people's intuitions, but there's always going to be more than one. You're never going to be able to say, to resolve into a single view the principle that if something does good to people, that's a reason to do it, which is the basic utilitarian thought, and the principle that if something violates a right, that's something you shouldn't do, which is these are rights theorists' basic thought.
Could be useful to end again with for non-philosophers, like as the simple definition of normativity and descriptive statements again. It's gone quite far in some ways.
Yes,
discussion,
yes.
To come back to it.
So people are much more agreed about examples of what's a normative statement and what's a descriptive statement than they are about definitions. I've said that I would like to define normative statements as statements that are about reasons.
Yeah.
They could be reasons to believe, reasons to act, or reasons to feel things.
And that usually involves a judgment of some kind, or...
Well, we're talking about a distinction between descriptive and normative judgments, right?
Right, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So my claim is that normative judgments are always judgments in one way or another about reasons for action, belief, or feeling. But yeah, I've written rather a large book about this.
Yes.
Plenty of people disagree. So
Have you changed your view at all since you wrote the book?
I'm afraid not.
None of your adversaries have changed your mind?
No, I mean, the book didn't, as it were, come out of the blue. I was writing things of that kind for some time before, so I sort of knew who the adversaries were.
I see.
And already had replies to their objections to my replies to their objections and so on. You know, this thing has been going for some time.
Thank you very much for being on the podcast. Thanks, Rollo.
Right,
Thank you.
right.